It's December 7th, 2021, and it's the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu, the Hawaiian island of Oahu in 1941. Here it is, we're just about 5 minutes before or 4 minutes before the attack began at that time. And today is a day of remembrance because the attack on Pearl Harbor played a very significant role in our history, and it had a dramatic effect not only on the course of events, but on the psyche and the psychology and philosophy of the American people and on American foreign policy. It's a big deal. And for me personally, it's where I'm from. I was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, and 30 years and 29 years, 13 months, and 1 week after the attack took place. So, Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese Navy, and at the beginning of it launched the beginning of the war in the Pacific, part of World War II, which affected every continent, nearly every continent on the planet. And the effects or the legacy of that conflict continue to impact us or affect us to this day. When we look at history, history is, a lot of dates, times, places, key figures. And, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, we know now that that is true. And of course, there's been other evidence that Christopher Columbus was not the first person, and history's been rewritten and revised over not just over decades, right? Especially with modern technology. But in this recent time of modern technology, of the airplane, of radio communications, radar, sonar, X-rays, at the time penicillin, even blood transfusions. The world was a much smaller place. And although it took time for news to travel from one place to another across the globe, news did travel fast. And I just want to take in a couple of minutes, we're going to take a moment as a moment of silence as that first bomb fell, that first initial firing of shots in anger at the United States by the Japanese at 7:55 a.m. Honolulu local time in that Sunday morning in December 1941. And so we think about the cause and the effect of these events. And it's not just about this one particular moment in time, but it's about what led up to it and also the legacy of that moment. And if you just bear with me in a moment, as the clock strikes 7:55 Hawaii local time, we'll take a moment of silence, of remembrance, of mourning, and reverence to that great generation that saw so much hardship and managed to find peace at the end of a very arduous, painful, disastrous struggle across the globe, which we call planet Earth. Just a few more seconds. And now let's just take a moment of silence, if we will. Pray if you want, meditate. Thank you for that moment of silent remembrance, honoring those who were there that morning, that Sunday morning. It was a time where the world was losing its innocence in Europe and in East Asia. And for the United States, with its two ocean navy, looming doom and mixed feelings were the sentiment of the day. We could see what was going on in Europe with Hitler and his expansion of Nazism and oppression of European nations and the people in Europe. We also saw Japanese expansion in response or reaction to European imperialism. And so I just want to take a moment to kind of bring you up to date from that moment in December 7th, 1941. It goes back nearly half a century before, or even further, with European imperialism in China, uh, the East Indies, which would be what we call Malaysia or Indonesia, um, and even the United States and its involvement in the expansion in the Pacific, with the defeat of the Spanish during the Spanish-American War at the end of the 19th century, where the United States gained certain territories, namely most prominently the Philippine Islands, which was once part of the Spanish Empire, which was, of course, over the course of a century in decline. And it was an opportunity for the United States to make a big land grab in the Pacific and expand its sphere of influence as it saw the European nations gain influence in China and other parts, the French and what we now know is Vietnam, but Thailand, what was then called French Indochina. The Japanese, of course, being an island nation, were isolated until, and although they did have some interaction with Europeans over the course of the centuries, the Portuguese, and then I believe maybe there might have been smaller incidences of other European nations trying to get their foothold into Japan. But it was when Commodore Perry from the United States who forcefully opened the doors of relations with the Japanese by firing cannon shots, in Tokyo Bay, that there was a real that the reality of imperialism came home to Japan. They had witnessed in other countries in the 19th century um, European expansion and imperialism, and how the British, for instance, had exploited the Chinese people through the use of opium, drug addiction, to diminish their ability to resist imperialism. And so the Japanese, frightened of what might become of them, went on and after the Meiji Restoration, they became very militaristic. And so, of course, being a warrior class, the shogun and the Bushido ideology, they sought to take it upon themselves to curtail any encroachment on their sovereignty. And to include, the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1906, which actually shocked the world, because the Western world, I would say, because in a time of great racism and inequality ideology, Asian peoples were not seen as equal to Western Europe, to Europeans, which of course is fallacy. But at the time, there was this mythology about inequality and race, and so there's all these misconceptions about peoples who looked different, and therefore they must be different on the inside. So there's a lot of prejudice at the time. And so when the Japanese, who had defeated militarily the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, the Battle of Tsushima Strait, the rest of the world took note. Of course, a few years later, less than a decade later, Western Europe and Russia would be embroiled in the First World War, to which Japan was an ally to the Western powers, the Allies versus the Central Powers, the German, Austro-Hungarian, and the like, in Ottoman empires. And so the landscape of the world changed after the First World War. Japan noticed that after the Spanish-American War, the United States was going to be a presence in the Pacific, and that caused them great concern. And so a sort of Cold War began to brew in the Pacific around the potential for the United States and Japan to, at some point in the future, become belligerents. And so what happened was the United States developed a philosophy of a two-ocean navy. Of course, under Theodore Roosevelt, president of the United States, he sent the Great White Fleet around the world during his presidency in the early 1900s as a show of force, a show of United States military might. And we went from being this fledgling nation who was licking its wounds from a civil war to a presence in the world community that would be taken seriously. It was a sign of, I believe it was kind of my take on it. It was kind of like an expression of maturity that we, the people of the United States as a nation, has grown up into adult nationhood. And so here we are with our Great White Fleet, our naval fleet, traveling the world, letting everybody know we're here and we're here to stay. And we are involved, and we are a force to be reckoned with, economically and, of course, militarily. And at the time, prior to nuclear weapons, the battleship, or the capital ship as it was called, was the weapon of mass destruction. The largest weapons ever produced by humanity were the rifles, the guns on those battleships. So the larger the gun, the greater the range, the greater the destructive power, the more powerful the nation. The number of ships, the size of the guns, their ability to affect great damage on their opponents led, so an arms race ensued. Of course, World War I was the epitome of battleship to battleship, surface combatant to surface combatant warfare up to that time. And it's the world community, after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, also, well, in addition to that, saw the need for treaties regarding naval warfare and ship sizes, their tonnage, and the size of their guns and number and so forth, as a way to create an imbalance, literally an imbalance of power, because those who lost out of the war, for instance, Germany, was dramatically limited in their capacity to defend themselves or to rebuild militarily after the First World War. Of course, Adolf Hitler saw this as an opportunity to capture the minds and hearts of the German people through in their vulnerability around this and their depressed economic state, to build a new military and instill national pride in the German people. And so he did this in violation to very well, at first subversively, and then outwardly, just a big, to heck with all of you folks. We're going to build. We're back on our feet, and we're here to stay, and we're going to be powerful, and all of those things. And so, arms limitation treaties, the London Treaty, the Washington Naval Treaty, these dictated the size and shapes of fleets or navies across the world for those who participated in those treaties. The largest, for instance, Great Britain or the United Kingdom or the British Empire at the time. The British Empire, which had been, there's that saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire, and that is a true statement because Britain had expanded its influence all around the globe. And at one time, at the time, had been the largest navy, the most powerful navy in the world up until the Second World War. And so here we have this tension between Japan, who is frightened to death of European expansion and becoming another colony. And then we have the United States, who is posturing itself as a developing world power after its hearty, contribution to putting an end to the war in Europe, World War One, and then the development of technology with the airplane. And this being new technology, the militaries of the world were curious, but yet unskilled in its implementation. They had, there was some theory, but then the battleship was the weapon of choice. It was the powerful weapon in the world, and so military doctrine was centered around the battleship as far as naval doctrine is concerned, until the Second World War. Now, politically, we need to look at what was going on in Europe and in Asia at the time. So we know that during the 1930s, from 1933 onward, Germany had been expanding under Nazism and Adolf Hitler. They had taken lands in the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia. They had annexed Austria, and by 1940 they had marched into France, and then of course in the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain. Now, the Battle of Britain is a whole different topic, and it is remarkable, historically poignant, because it was the first time an entire battle in the defense of a nation was undertaken through air power. But this was a sign of the times, and it was very, very important. In fact, I just want to take one moment to acknowledge that the Battle of Britain probably was the turning point in world history, in that those few who flew and defended the British Isles from German aggression probably saved the free world. Because had they not defended, had they not been successful, the invasion of England and subsequent probably loss, England wasn't ready, and we weren't ready to help them in a way that was substantial enough to defend the British Isles. It would have ended up like that alternate history, like, for instance, Man in the High Castle, which is on Amazon Prime, where in other movies that have depicted an alternate reality where the United States and Germany are now in diplomatic relations, and Nazism is the four in Europe and all of that. It would have been a different story altogether, were it not for those brave pilots and those brave men and women of all in all walks of life in Britain, who defended so fiercely and coordinated so masterfully the defense of Great Britain from the German Luftwaffe, and thereby preventing the invasion of the British Isles. So, which leads to the attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto Bay in Italy in November of 1940. Now, this was a big deal. 40 or 41. This is a big deal, because what this showed to the Japanese was that surface ships were susceptible to torpedo attack by aircraft. Now, some years earlier, General Billy Mitchell in the United States Army Air Corps had tested the viability of using aircraft as to attack naval surface ships using surrendered German vessels, and this was undertaken off the coast of the eastern seaboard in the United States. And this shocked the Navy, and they said, "Uh-oh." And it affected U.S. military doctrine and policy, and also put some limitations on U.S. implementation of air power, the direction in which we were to take as far as developing naval aviation. At the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese were the premier naval aviators of the world. They had more aircraft carriers than any other nation on the planet, and they had the most disciplined, most highly skilled naval aviators in the world at the time. Now, what brought us into conflict with them? Why an attack on Pearl Harbor? Why attack the United States? Why bring military aggression into the Pacific between the United States and Japan? Well, what happened was during the Japanese expansion, they had invaded Manchuria. Manchuria is part of China and Mongolia area. They had already been fighting with the Russians over territories which were contested since time immemorial. And then footage, thanks to photography, footage of what is now known as the rape of Nanking, showing Japanese atrocities surfaced, was brought out of China and shared with the world. And this was intolerable to Western civilization, Europe, and in the United States. Now, Japan, being an island nation, required resources from other countries. So just as the Europeans were coming in and taking from their colonies, quote unquote colonies, in these nations in Eastern Asia, the United States, Japan needed to do the same. They needed resources as well. And so they're essentially frightened into building a military. And they were frightened into and inspired by the Europeans to expand their own empire beyond their own shores. Now, this has been attempted a couple of times in their history, and to little or no success up until I would say they succeeded with the annexation of Korea, and then they started to move into the rest of Eastern Europe, or Eastern Asia, East Asia. So that took place, and so these atrocities came, and so seeing this, the United States implemented an embargo on oil sales to Japan. They said, we're and other raw materials. They're like, we're not going to sell to you so that you can go into China and kill babies and rape women and commit these atrocities. That's unacceptable. Well, this put a damper on Japan's production and their war effort and their expansion. And so a series of diplomatic meetings had taken place and were taking place between their envoy and our representative, up until the very last moment, that Sunday morning of December 7th, 1941. And this actually is called gunboat diplomacy. And where does that come from? It comes all the way back to Commodore Perry firing that shot, Tokyo Bay, back in the day, where like, we are going to force diplomatic relations with you. Gunboat diplomacy. And so basically, that's what the attack on Pearl Harbor was. The ideology behind the attack on Pearl Harbor was, if the Japanese, we being the Japanese, could diminish the American naval capability to resist our expansion, then that would put us in a stronger position to negotiate with them. The Japanese had modeled their fleet of battleships. In fact, some of their battleships were even built by the British. And then as the 20s became the 30s, things shifted between the relationship between Japan and Great Britain. And they had learned enough and figured out enough to get into their own development of technology, and actually were quite good. And one thing we know about the Japanese and their culture is they're committed to excellence in all things. It's an amazing thing. And so Japanese are about quality. Their culture really supports quality. And they took that technology, ran with it, and developed it for themselves. And they built their fleet. So that morning, December 7th, we have this doctrine where the United States had developed a doctrine where we are going to have to fight the Japanese on the high seas, a la the Battle of Jutland, like the German High Seas Fleet and the British Grand Fleet during the First World War. Battleship line on battleship line, somewhere out in the middle of the Pacific. With the advent and introduction of air power and the feasibility of it via the Battle of Britain, Germany's Blitzkrieg campaign in Europe, and the British Royal Navy's attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto, everything that the Japanese needed to know about how to successfully carry out a naval air attack on an enemy fleet, all the ingredients were there. They studied it with intensity and with great scrutiny, and then they went about their plan. And so they had a meeting. There's supposed to be a meeting. And the great movie for this, to really get into the details of this, is the movie Tora, 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 which was produced released out in theatrically. It was theatrically released in, I believe, 1970. In fact, my parents were in Hawaii at the time during the filming of this movie, and it was quite a thing for the residents of Oahu to have to relive all of those airplanes flying over and the pyrotechnics of the explosions. It was like reliving the trauma all over again. So we have a breakdown of diplomatic relations. We have greed and expansion and fear as the motivations for this imperialism and this imperialist expansion and the taking of resources from other peoples, which led to a breakdown of diplomatic relations and also this racism and an ideology of inequality, which led to these atrocities. So this elitism of the human based on race, and then this greed, fear-based greed, and then this development of weapons, which led to this attack on Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese had back to that morning, the Japanese had set a diplomatic message to be delivered to the U.S. representative, Cordell Hull. It was 14 parts, and essentially what it was an ultimatum. And it said, succinctly, it said, if you don't put a cease to these embargoes, we will have no choice but to go to war with you. Now, there had been the rumors of war, or there had been messages or indicators that the Japanese were up to something, but the United States didn't really pay too close attention. They had been very good at keeping their plans secret for the most part, not completely because word got out, but unfortunately, the word wasn't taken as seriously as it should have been. And the threat assessment, that's a military term, the threat assessment was one of probable sabotage. And so the control measures that were taken by the U.S. command in Honolulu or on the island of Oahu was to prepare for and prevent possible occurrences of sabotage. And this led to, as it's well known, the parking of aircraft out in the middle of the airfields, leaving them quite exposed. And then, of course, the rot of destruction as a result of all of that, because the threat assessment was incorrect. So we know that the attack took place. It was 2 hours that shocked the world. The United States was shocked into mobilization. We know that war was coming whether we liked it or not. We were already getting somewhat involved with the war in Europe through Lend-Lease and patrol and naval patrols and U-boat infested waters off the eastern seaboard in the United States, Canada, Greenland, and Iceland. We also were involved in helping the defense of China against Japanese aggression through the American Volunteer Group, which was basically a special operations group put together by the United States military under the guise of civilian volunteers flying U.S. equipment and providing U.S. equipment to the nationalist Chinese. And so, we were already involved, but what got us into it was this attack on Pearl Harbor. And so the U.S. 7th Fleet was devastated. Ironically, of course, American naval air power was not necessarily affected because all of the aircraft carriers that would have been in Pearl Harbor were not. And so the whole tone from the beginning to the very end of the Pacific War in World War II was centered around naval aviation. And it began with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the simultaneous attack on the garrison in the Philippines that very same day, and then also with the sinking of the British battleship and battleship Prince of Wales and the British battlecruiser Repulse 3 days later, and then also leading to the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of that year of 1942, and then of course the Battle of Midway, which then turned things to the favor of the United States. And then, of course, the island hopping campaign with the Solomon Islands, the attack on Wake, and truck and the Marshall Islands and all of those things that took place all the way up into Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and then, of course, the end of the war in the Pacific following the end of the war in Europe. So when we think about World War II, if you're an American, we think Pearl Harbor, we think D-Day, we think Okinawa, we think Battle of Midway, we think Iwo Jima, and we think the atomic bombs. If you're Japanese, I would imagine it's probably all about the atomic bombs being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and not much after that. Maybe something about Pearl Harbor. But I know for me, I wouldn't want to ruminate on the things that I did that were, you know, what maybe I would call misdeeds. And so the Japanese, probably don't really think about their involvement in the atrocities with China, or the Bataan, or like in the Philippines. If you're a Filipino or a Filipino American, what do you think of when you think of World War II? You think of the Japanese invasion, the occupation, and the Bataan Death March. If you're a German who you just want to get on with your life and like not be reminded about this, of course, there's Adolf Hitler, the invasion of Europe, the war with Russia, and of course the Holocaust. And if you're a British person, you're probably thinking about the fall of Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, D-Day, Operation Market Garden, and of course the victory over the Nazi German regime. So what's left? What's left after 7 years of intense conflict across the globe? Well, today, those who were our enemies in that moment in time are now some of our most staunch allies and dearest friends as nations. And that's what we really need to look at. And I think our wounds, as the greatest generation is nearly left this planet in physical form, who we owe so much to here in the free world for creating a free world. Um, those wounds can heal from the subsequent generations, like myself or my parents' generation, the children of those who fought that war. Um, courage, human courage, human resilience, and a willingness to move on. It's not easy. It's not easy when you've lost a loved one, or you've lost your home, or your whole life. When we look at the effects of the Holocaust and how 1 in 3 European Jews were taken from us, taken from this planet, and how large families became small families, and reparations and return of lost goods has yet to be completed. How there has been an attempt to bring justice to those who were perpetrators in that, with the Nazi war trials, to which are still under investigation today. And the creation of an sovereign Israeli state, which was born from immigrants, refugees, really, of the Holocaust. And also, communist expansion as a result of the end of World War II. U.S. involvement in world affairs, a very proactive involvement in world affairs, from the Berlin airlift to the Marshall Plan, the defense against communist expansion and the Iron Curtain, through the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, to the arming of the French so that they could fight the communism, or fight the Vietnamese in French Indochina, and now Vietnam, to our involvement in the Korean War, our conflict, and the failure of the United Nations to maintain peace on this planet as a result of having survived the Second World War. We're now a nuclear aged military, and we as a human race, or a human species, have the capability to eradicate ourselves from the face of this earth with nuclear weapons, which are similar to the very sun that gives us life, through hydrogen bombs. And there are still people on this planet who are starving to death, who don't have homes, who are not treated with equality, even in our own nation as Americans. Racism still prevails, inequality still prevails, hunger still exists, slavery still exists. We have a lot of work to do yet. But what we can do now is we can forgive. We can look to those people who we thought were very different from us because maybe they looked different, they spoke a different language, had a different religion, and a different culture, and see the commonality of our experience as human beings. We can say, you are my brother, you are my sister. We can work together. Even as, like even with China right now, China is a very strong economy. And why? Because we buy a lot of things from them and they want to be respected. And even today in the West, there's still a disparity amongst of mutual respect between the Chinese and other nations, and even the United States. There's some tension there. So we really need to look at where we come from, what we've done as a people. When I mean people, I mean as a species. In these moments, like the attack on Pearl Harbor and how it affected the American psyche, we were traumatized by that attack. We said, never again. We said, always be prepared. Remember Pearl Harbor. And then 20 years ago, this past September, just a few weeks ago, the anniversary of the World Trade Center attacks in the Pentagon and the traumatic loss of life, which far surpasses those who lost their lives on Oahu that morning in December 1941. And the wars in the Middle East that were the result of that, our involvement in Afghanistan and in Iraq, to which I spent 2 tours, combat tours there, almost 2 years actually of my life were spent in the combat zone in Iraq. And so we owe it to that great generation who fought World War II. I think it's important that we show a deference of respect to the fighting men and women from every nation, because a soldier's duty is to their nation and not necessarily an ideology. Being a soldier is not a political statement necessarily. It's one of service to one's people. Right, ideologically, right or wrong, courage is the same on the battlefield. And so that creates a commonality and a fraternity or a sorority amongst those who participated. And we can put aside our differences and we can be friends and we can love one another and we can find a way to solve our problems without having to rattle swords or even draw them, and absolutely without shedding blood. We can find solutions to the world's problems through dialogue and openness and communication. We can work just as hard to preserve the peace as we have done to prosecute a war. These are the lessons and the legacies of that morning here for us Americans who remember Pearl Harbor. And we have those reminders of that time sitting there in the harbor just today. We have the wreck, which is also a grave, of the U.S. battleship Arizona BB-39, symbolizing, and the memorial which stands over it. And also we have just to the south of her the battleship Missouri, upon which the surrender documents were signed by all participants in Tokyo Bay some 5 years later. It marks the beginning and the end of a chapter in our history, in American history, in Japanese history, in world history. It's a reminder of a very painful moment amongst brothers, amongst neighbors, amongst the world family. A reminder to never again hurt one another in such a way that the for generations hence, we still cry, remember Pearl Harbor. Thank you for your time. Take care of yourself.